Aaron, which one?
My next speaker is Aaron. Aaron Gove. Welcome, Aaron. Thank you for coming to speak to us. We really appreciate it. And Aaron is a senior scientist at the consulting company Astron Environmental Services, where he mainly designs and analyzes monitoring programs associated with mining and oil and gas. Prior to this, he worked as an academic, gaining an interest and belief in agroforestry systems through research in Mexico, Ethiopia, and the West Australian Wheatbelt. He still pursues research into restoring the Wheatbelt as a personal interest. Fun fact, he looks forward to going camping once the symposium is over. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, everybody. I sometimes get a bit nervous before giving talks too, but I'm looking forward to the adrenaline warming me up a little bit. So firstly I have a confession to make. I have no family links with the Wheatbelt at all. I grew up in the Adelaide Hills, and it wasn't until later that I got to do some work in the Wheatbelt. But I've always enjoyed connecting with people working on the land, and I've found the Wheatbelt a really kind of exciting, interesting place with its own challenges as well. And I thank you all for the opportunity to talk here today and connect with everyone here. So this is Sandalwood. So agroforestry has been mentioned as in the Carnaby Cockatoo talk as a useful option or a useful tool. It can never replace native vegetation, but it is sort of that compromise between a broadacre crop and bushland, and it does provide some habitat, things like corridors and that sort of thing. So that plantation is Sandalwood, Rewards, which was north of New Norcia, and we're talking about amenity and the joy we get from trees. And some of these plantations are really sort of nice and pleasant places to arrive at and walk through and look at, and that's a really nice sort of profile of a sort of a woodland, different than any sort of absolutely native woodland, but still very, very nice. And what I found was that they're pretty good habitat. I mainly looked at birds, and found a lot of woodland birds in them. Was quite impressed. So this talk is basically, an optimistic talk about what we can get out of agroforestry and what it supports. So some of it's my work, and then I've scratched together results from other studies in the Western Australian Wheatbelt. I decided to just talk about two issues in the Wheatbelt here. One is the reserve system is less than 5% of the total area. When you look at those posters, the numbers are higher because that's the total remnant vegetation, which is about 10 to 15%, I think. But the actual reserve system is about 5%. And we've seen from the historical background why that is. There's been lots of clearing. And basically that 5%, no one decided to put reserves there really, but it's all, or a reserve around a granite outcrop, they couldn't clear it, and that's, it's what's left over, and that's why there's no salmon gum, for instance, because it's nice land to clear. And also in the Wheatbelt there's lots of known declines of native species. Obviously plants, mammals too, birds. This is just a map of the different IBRA regions, bioregions, and there's the Wheatbelt, which is the palest one, and that's because the reserve system is lower than 5%. So in Western Australia it's the only area that has that low degree of reserve coverage. If I included the rest of Australia, there's quite a few on the east coast that have low reserve coverages as well. Now you don't have to take too much in here, but I thought I would put it up just to highlight. There's a couple of vertical lines green one and a red vertical line. And at 30% reserve coverage, the sort of rule of thumb is that's when you start to get declines in species. They start to, the connectivity of the landscape breaks up and species start to decline. And then you're in more trouble if you get down to 10%. Remember, I said that the reserve system is 5%. The native vegetation might be 10 or 15. So we're obviously in that area of serious conservation issues in the Wheatbelt. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So that's led to the woodlands of the area being declared critically endangered by federal government because of that low degree of reservation. And a couple of stats. So this is based on some atlasing of birds over time. It's a little bit old data now. So of all the woodland birds that are known in the Wheatbelt, 62% of them are known to be declining over time. So a lot of them. And this is just based on the Avon. I couldn't get a general Wheatbelt statistic, but I imagine it must be about the same. There's about 11 threatened mammal species in the region. And I go back to that story about birds, and a lot of those declining birds are actually found in agroforestry, so it's a bit of a helping hand there. Agroforestry is basically the idea of integrating tree crops with other crops, basically designed to diversify incomes and production and diversify habitats. From a biodiversity angle, they provide resources, mainly food for animals and things like that. As we've mentioned before, native vegetation improves microclimates, provides shelter like litter and logs and rocks that are left and things like that. And I've used the word landscape permeability, so that's just almost talking about corridors, so similar sort of thing. So the vegetation, which is represented by the agroforestry, actually promotes movement of animals and insects, potentially dispersal of plants through the landscape, which is really important for survival. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is all the agroforestry systems I'm talking about today, they're all native to Australia and mostly native to the Wheatbelt region as well. So all this agroforestry is introducing native plants, native trees back to the environment, which is a really positive thing. So we're talking about the benefits of biodiversity and pest control and things like that. So I thought I'd just highlight some numbers from the literature. So honeyeaters eat between 24 and 36 kilos of insects per hectare per year. Sugar gliders, 3.2 kilograms of insects per year, so these are potentially pest insects. One thing that we haven't mentioned, and is always somewhat overrated, are bats. So in terms of their habitat, they need hollows as well, tree hollows, and they're also fantastic at eating insects. So they could, eat thousands of insects over one night. And if you have an isolated tree in a pasture with a hollow, that tree's foraging around your crop. That bat is foraging around your crop all night. Talking about insects and pest control. So wasps, for instance, they're often what we call parasitoids. So they don't eat the pests, but they lay their eggs in the pest, and then when those young hatch, they kill the insect. There's also other things like predatory beetles. What else? All sorts of things. And also bees responsible for pollination, which we all hear about quite a lot these days. So basically what I'm suggesting is agroforestry has the potential to support these creatures, and then they have the potential to act in a kind of functional role. This is also very related to the last talk. So this is based on some CSIRO work. They worked in three states, including Western Australia, and basically what they found was when they sampled weedy systems, they found pest insects. But if they sampled native vegetation, they found the insects that provided positive benefits, like these parasitoid wasps and that sort of thing. So native vegetation was supporting those beneficial insects more so than pest insects. So that's another good reason to have native agroforestry crops. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the different types of agroforestry in the Wheatbelt, and then highlight some of the biodiversity benefits that I'm aware of. If you're interested in looking into this, the Wheatbelt NRM produced a really good document which is available on the internet that goes through all the different systems and a lot of information about establishing them as well. So Sandalwood is probably my favourite agroforestry crop, and so it's mainly planted for the oil, which is similar to the Indian sandalwood oil, which is meant to have a pretty good lucrative market. Some people are also selling the nuts as well to make sort of oil and things out of that. As you can see from that map, it's indigenous to the area too, which is fantastic. So the very interesting thing about sandalwood is it's a hemiparasite. So that means that it has roots which tap into the roots of native plants, and it sucks the nutrients out. It basically steals the nutrients from other plants. So that means whenever a farmer plants sandalwood, they need to plant it with a host. Jeff Woodall is the sort of Western Australian sandalwood expert. In the field, when he was looking around, he found 68 different hosts of sandalwood plants. So that's a lot of different native species. So as I said, the farmers have to grow it with a host. They generally grow it with Acacia acuminata, the jam. I'm sure you heard about the smell of jam when it burns. It smells like jam. And so most people just grow it with maybe one host, also the jam, sometimes with casuarina as well. Jeff Woodall's properties, and he basically does it for a business as well, they have up to 40 different species of host plant. So I did something silly there because I put the text over the picture, but that's Jeff Woodall's plantation, and it's really kind of dense with a whole variety of different flowering plants like grevilleas and acacias and everything. It's just really dense. So he's got quite big kind of alleys, but gaps between the alleys. And if you had narrower ones, he'd have this fantastic environment. But even now, it's incredible. And he also leaves some isolated woody large trees as well, which really helps the system in terms of birds and things. So for that reason, that diversity can be a really interesting crop. And every single one I go to, every single plantation is completely different than the other. They're all very different. Melaleuca, brushwood, some of the melaleucas that people grow in the Wheatbelt are from Victoria, from the east coast. So you can grow in the sort of wetter areas, marginal bits of land that you can't crop, which is always handy, and it's just great for the normal sort of brush to make fences and screening and that sort of thing. Quite sort of simple, no hosts or anything like that. But I'm surprised to find some birds in that, some interesting birds. So there's forage shrubs like saltbush, which is also good for ricotta triangles as well. Also timber. Wheatbelt's not really sort of big for timber. I know that Jeff Woodall was looking to a casuarina, a she oak system of growing timber in places like the Wheatbelt. There's obviously carbon was mentioned before. Might not be the best time to get into carbon, but there's still an international market and people are still interested in offsetting things, so that people are still paying people to plant trees. And also the oil, like mallee oil, that sort of thing. And the mallee oil, the mallee plantation is down the bottom. That's usually grown those narrow alleys. Birds. So this is some work I did with Avon Grove, based in sort of Avon, but I went from the sort of southern Wheatbelt up to, I think, up to around about here actually. So based on that bird atlasing, I could work out what birds were declining in the Wheatbelt. So birds that in this category are priority birds are birds that will probably continue to decline unless we act in some way. So in brushwood, I actually identified 4 different priority bird species, so birds that are declining, and also 5 woodland-dependent species. So the woodland-dependent species are stable, but they rely on woodlands. But they also use brushwood. Sandalwood's significantly better, so 7 priority species and 19 woodland-dependent species. And I didn't look at oil mallee, but Patrick Smith from Syrah used to do a lot of work in the Wheatbelt. And he found from 20 of the 33 birds that he saw, 22 were considered to be in decline. So all those systems support birds that probably aren't supported in the rest of the system or the landscape. So they're not supported in broadacre crops, for instance. So there is sort of a promise there, some promise. So here's an example. So in brushwood and sandalwood, I think there was a total of 7 species altogether. So 4 of them were 4 were recorded in the brushwood. So blue-breasted fairy wren, inland thornbill, rufous whistler, red-capped robin. So they're all principally insectivorous birds. Not super rare, but still declining in the Wheatbelt. And all very appealing birds. And so this is another sandalwood system. This is from Kalingari. This is Aaron Edmonds' property. It's a really kind of nice, pleasant property to be in as well. So grey striped thrush, quite a big bird, very insectivorous. And the spiny-cheeked honey was quite a surprising one. It was only found in this property. And there's also that thornbill as well. So quite a lot of sort of sensitive birds using these different forestry systems. So here's some of my data. This is the number of species of woodland-dependent bird species. So obviously sandalwood supported the most. Up to 13 species, even higher than the woodlands that I looked at. And then brush, a few species, and very few observed in Luton. So this isn't my work, and I haven't talked too much about mammals today, but this is the western pygmy possum, and it was found by this honours student to use. This was radio tracked, and it was actually found to forage through the alleys of mallee. And one important thing about this is it foraged and used the flowers and ate things in the mallee, but it actually lived in an isolated tree with hollows. So again, they're essential to the system. Mei Chen looked at lizards. Basically, they were using all habitats, but generally most rich in the remnants and sometimes in the sandalwood as well. Another thing about that was the diet was more carnivorous in the woodland, and then it became more omnivorous, so plants and meat in the pasture and the sandalwood. So there's something that's not being provided in the sandalwood there that's being provided in the other habitats. I also looked at insects. So that insect on the right, that's a wasp, and it's about 2 mil long. So when you trap these insects, you can't see them in the air. You can only see them when you're in a trap. And when you look at the trap, it just looks like plant material. It's not until you get to the lab that you find all these amazing iridescent little micro wasps and things like that. Now, bird watching is really pleasant. That's just to tell you that looking at insects isn't as pleasant because you just sit in a lab for almost a year. And that's the different trap types. That's a sort of a tent that the wasps run into, and that's a bowl with water and detergent, and it's painted blue, and that attracts bees. So all the systems supported wasps, so even the lupin. So there's not so much evidence that the sort of sandalwood's good for wasps, but the brushwood was also good, one of the highest ones. And you know, even though you can't see these, one of those brush systems had more than 30 different wasp species, these tiny 1, 2, 3 mil wasps. It's incredible. I wish I could actually take that on and understand them better, but I'm not capable. Yeah, and that's a pity, because we know about birds and, you know, what functions they have and which ones do what. Half these wasps don't even have names. You know, no one knows what they are. Yeah. So there's a lot of information there, but we just don't have it yet. Beetles. I might just skip that. There's also beetles. This is someone else's study. Mei Chen again did honours on beetles, and Anita did a PhD. So they found lots of beetles in oil mallee, but they basically looked on the plant and on the ground, and they're actually sort of quite different than what's in the pasture. And they could be predatory insects. So some of those beetles. So my conclusions. When I step into agroforestry systems, I find them remarkable habitats. I think they're really worth placing into the Wheatbelt sort of system and getting more out here. One thing I haven't really said is they also allow diversification of incomes, support important components of wildlife, demonstrated lots of insects. Certainly lots of birds that you won't find anywhere else if we lose the woodlands. They obviously sort of complement and support the woodlands, sort of extend out the woodlands. Lots of declining insectivorous birds, well, several, probably not lots. Potentially important insects as well, and they also have the potential to provide corridors or make landscapes more permeable, allow things like birds to disperse through the environment. And apart from that, I've got one picture which I found on a US site. So it's sort of not a conclusion really, because all I've talked about is this. But as we said before, I think agroforestry is a really useful tool. It's no silver bullet, but yeah, definitely a useful tool for a place like the Wheatbelt. Thank you.